This evening, we're going to try and introduce you to the poetry of William Blake, probably one of the most radical and eccentric figures in English poetic history. He was born in 1757 and died in 1827, so he lived through probably one of the most turbulent periods in English history, and European history. And the poems we're going to read this evening come from this period of revolution. The first lot of poems is called the Songs of Innocence from 1789, the year of the French Revolution. And Songs of Experience comes from 1793, after the terror had started and shocked everybody. And Blake initially went around London wearing a bonnet rouge, the red beret that symbolized the revolutionaries. But he took that off as England increasingly became hostile to France, and as people realized what a human catastrophe the revolution was. But I think it tells you something about his radical views on society. He was also profoundly religious, and his poems really have a very mystical note and strike at the heart of injustice in society. He was both mystical and saw the role of the poet as prophetic. I think he saw himself like one of the Old Testament prophets. And at the same time was very, very concerned about the poor, and particularly about injustices to children. So there are frequent references to boys made to sweep chimneys, for example, which was one of the dreadful things which gave them awful cancerous diseases, and to the poverty that lay behind the superficial wealth of late 18th century society. And he was also radical in another way. All these poems were engraved, not printed. And he engraved in metal plates, but in a very complicated process that involved about 6 different stages to produce one print. And it's almost symbolic of Blake that he was very early in opposing the multiplicity of modern society, of the machine age. And on the contrary, what he wanted to do was produce art that was individual, that was singular. And you can find that in all of these poems. They're not illustrated. The writing is engraved and winds in many cases into the leaves and the branches that are either side of the picture, as it were. And his portrait of London, perhaps one of the most radical of these poems, is one of the poems we're going to read. One of the poems we're not going to read, but is very, very famous in England, is a poem called Jerusalem from a later collection, which is now sung as if it was a sort of national anthem. People sing it at all public occasions. It was sung during the Jubilee in various places. And, but in fact, it's a very radical poem. It's really asking, can we make England as it was in the time when Jesus is supposed to have walked in this island? That's all in a question in the first stanza. but in the second he's saying, well, give me my bow of burning gold, let me prophetically lead into this. Many of his poems have been set to music several times by different composers. And the poem I'm going to start with is called The Lamb, which has been set to music by one of the greatest modern religious composers, a man called John Tavener. It's a beautiful setting. It's worth listening to on YouTube. And it's almost, as it were, the opposite of another poem we'll read a bit later on called The Tiger, which is perhaps more famous. But there are two opposite aspects of creation, calm, meek, the lamb, and of course with all its associations with the mystic lamb, with the Lamb of God, with the sacrifice of the Mass, and then the tiger symbolizing this, the power and energy that is also in creation. So I'll start with the lamb. The lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright? Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee, little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild, he became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee, little lamb, God bless thee. Not at all as simple as it seems at first sight. And the second poem I'm going to read is also from the Songs of Innocence, but again makes it clear that injustice is one of the targets of these poems. Holy Thursday. 'Twas on a holy Thursday, their innocent faces clean, the children walking two and two in red and blue and green. Grey-headed beadles walked before with wands as white as snow, till into the high dome of Paul's they like Thames waters flow. Oh, what a multitude they seemed, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies they sit with radiance all their own. The hum of multitudes was there, but multitudes of lambs. Thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. Now, like a mighty wind, they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like harmonious thunderings, the seats of heaven among. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. It's a wonderful picture, of course, of these City of London children, the children from the Christ Hospital, founded by the city alderman in 1552, and they wore a distinctive blue coat, so they became known as the Blue Coat School. It's that with red berets originally. So it's that picture of innocence that these children with nice white collars portrayed. But underneath this is a kind of warning of what can happen, and The lamb comparison, of course, is meant to make it clear that these can easily be sacrificed. The third poem is called The Divine Image. And again, you can see how Blake is emphasizing that human beings are made in the image of God. But of course, that image must be cherished and preserved and guarded, especially in innocent children. The Divine Image. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child, and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form, in heathen, Turk, or Jew. Where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. The next poem, also from the Songs of Innocence, is The Chimney Sweeper. And this refers to this appalling practice of using young boys to go up chimneys and sweep away the soot. So they literally become victims of the industrial revolution of coal, burning coal. And as I said, it produced dreadful diseases for them. The Chimney Sweeper. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind. For when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet. And that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain leaping, laughing they run, and wash in a river, and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Again, this awful sense of impending doom hanging over these children who are being exploited by this society. The next poem I'm going to read is perhaps one of Blake's most famous poems. It's incredibly short, and in the original engraving, the poem is right in the middle of the winding of the rose. But people have puzzled over this poem and discussed it and discussed all the implications of it. It's quite remarkable that in 8 short lines, so much should be packed in. The sick rose. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. I think it's one of those poems that defies analysis, but it's so full of, so resonant with meaning. And then the poem that's almost the companion piece of the first poem I read, The Lamb, and this is The Tiger, a poem that's incredibly popular with children because they love the trochaic, steady beat of the poem. The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? The next poem is a wonderful poem with Blake's not only radical view of society, but radical view of the church. And you've got him here laying into the idea of the church as simply a restrictive organization with walls and barriers and do-nots. And for Blake, religion, I say, was a very prophetic, vital, not at all this religion of forbidding negative instructions. The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. one suspects that Blake's own pronunciation in this period was much closer to a modern Irish pronunciation, where you'd hear the R's coming through there. So as well as those strong plosives and binding with briars, get this R sound binding with briars, my joys and desires. So you get the much fiercer condemnation of the church as a negative institution. Blake was very, as I say, mystical, felt he once had a vision of angels in his street. And then a poem which I think is familiar to many of you, London. Again, the engraving is a very, very moving one, showing a London street. And London at this stage, of course, was a place of immense injustice and poverty. It wasn't long, 1789, was not only the revolution in France, but it was only 9 years after the biggest civil disturbances in English social history. The Gordon riots of 1780 started as an anti-Catholic riots led by a man called Lord George Gordon, who'd come down from Scotland to stir up activity against the first stage in Catholic emancipation. And he'd been successful in Scotland in holding it back. So he came down to London, and within a short time, he'd got the mob going, and they had 5 days of burning and looting. And in the end, they had to call in the Hanoverian troops, and 300 people were shot before the riots were calmed down. And it's hardly ever mentioned in English history because it wasn't started as an anti-Catholic riot. So London was a place of, again, immense contrasts, and you get this radical criticism of both the establishment, the political establishment, and the church. The state and the church are both in this poem excoriated for colluding with the suffering of innocent soldiers who die in the service of wars of the state, and poverty causing young girls to be sold as harlots, and blighting everything, this word that comes through right at the end of the poem. London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. I don't think there's a stronger poem in English on the injustices of society, and you can see it's very, it was in London in the 1780s, but it's still rife in many parts of the world, and even shockingly in places that the West has abandoned, like Afghanistan now, where people are so poor that children are being sold. And then another absolutely mysterious poem, shocking us with what it says. what it says about ourselves. In this case, not so much society being attacked, but the human heart. A poison tree. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles, and with soft, deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine, and into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. And finally, a poem simply called A Divine Image, reminding us again of the Blake's view of mankind. Man is made in God's image. A divine image. Cruelty has a human heart, and jealousy a human face. Terror the human form divine, and secrecy the human dress. The human dress is forged iron, the human form a fiery forge, the human face a furnace sealed, the human heart its hungry gorge. It's a good poem to end on, Blake, because so much of Blake is concerned with this gap between the ideal and what actually happens in society, in the church, in individuals. And I don't think there's a poet in English that's so challenging and so rich in resonance, imagery and language. It's completely unique, sui generis. Thank you.